to the foot, and a busted stick from the defense's en route, covered up with 2.8 seconds to go in period number one. And the blade of the stick coming off of that of Brian O'Hanley.
In this video, I'm going to show you some tube radios made by the Northern Electric Company in the 1940s and 50s, and tell you a bit about radios of this era. Northern Electric started as a Canadian division of the Bell Telephone Company that produced telephones and telephone equipment. It later expanded into other markets, including radio manufacturing, and became independent of the U.S. parent company. Most notably, they manufactured the standard rotary dial telephone, or 500 set, that you see here. In the late 70s, the company name was changed to Northern Telecom, and later Nortel Networks, reflecting the switch from telephony to telecommunications and networking. After the internet bubble burst, a recession, and a series of accounting scandals, the company filed for bankruptcy protection. The majority of its businesses were split up and sold off, and today all that is left of Canada's foremost telecommunications company is a portfolio of patents, which a number of buyers, including Google and RIM, are bidding on. The market for consumer radio started in the 1920s with primitive equipment that was expensive, large in size, and hard to set up and operate. Sales increased through the 30s despite the Depression. During World War II, most radio manufacturers shifted to the war effort, and most production of consumer radios was put on hold. After the war, a number of factors, including pent-up demand, improvements in tubes and electronics design, and the strong economy, caused a huge boom in radio sales in North America. Consumers could now buy an inexpensive, small, easy-to-operate radio, and they sold in the millions. The basic low-end radio featured AM reception and followed a standard design using 5 vacuum tubes, now often called the All-American 5 or AA5. Northern Electric manufactured radios for the Canadian market, mostly in Montreal, Quebec, and Belleville, Ontario. Let's have a look at a few of these radios from my collection. I've chosen 10 representative models. All of them have been restored and are in working order. First up is a Model 5000. This radio was officially known as the Baby Champ, and sometimes called the Rainbow by collectors because of the distinctive curves of the case. It was offered in several colors. This one is in natural brown bakelite. It was manufactured in Montreal, Canada around 1946. It uses 5 octal tubes. Like most of these radios, it offers just the AM broadcast band with controls for volume and tuning. You could use an external wire antenna, but most people could get by with the built-in coil antenna. Let's take out the chassis and take a look at the components inside. At the front we see the speaker and dial lamp. From the top we see the tuning capacitor with dial string and pulley to tuning knob. There are 5 tubes, 3 metal tubes and 2 are glass. 2 IF transformers, an electrolytic capacitor, actually 3 capacitors in one unit, the audio output transformer which drives the speaker, and the coil antenna with connection for external antenna. At the bottom we see the tube sockets, capacitors, and resistors, volume control, oscillator coil, and trimmer cap. I've replaced the original wax paper caps with new ones. The construction is all point-to-point wiring soldered by hand. The case styling has been called Machine Age or Art Deco. This is probably the most famous model of Northern Electric AA5, and they were made in such large quantities that they are not rare or particularly valuable. Many of these radios feature cases made from bakelite. Bakelite was an early plastic that's formed under heat and pressure. It can take high temperatures, is hard but brittle, and will crack. It's opaque, and the natural color was brown or black. Sometimes material was added to achieve a wood grain effect. It was often painted with other colors such as white. When rubbed, real bakelite has a distinctive odor. As used in radios, bakelite is not particularly valuable. It should not be confused with a bakelite plastic called Catalin, which is very expensive and valuable in a radio. This model 5002 from 1946 is the Northern Electric Baby Champ bakelite table radio, identical to the model 5000, but with a short wave band, running from approximately 6 to 15 megahertz. With a single shortwave band, a small dial, and no band spread, it's difficult to tune shortwave stations. There's no loop antenna, just a length of wire. The third knob selects between AM broadcast and shortwave bands. The radio is quite sensitive even on shortwave. This is amazing for a radio with only 5 tubes. AA5 radios were inexpensive, but some models included deluxe features. These features often included a dial lamp so you could read the dial in a dark room, a phono input jack. This let you connect a phonograph, record player, or turntable and use the radio as the amplifier. Most often a switch was included that selected radio or phono function. A few were so crude that you had to tune the radio to an unused part of the dial when using the phono input. Some later radios had a television input for audio only. Presumably this was to future-proof your radio when TV became popular. A deluxe case, typically wood. A tone control. A clock, often with alarm feature. Support for one or more short wave bands. This is a model 5404 from 1951. This set was known as the Panda. It came in various colors, turquoise, brown, and ivory. It uses miniature tubes, which were becoming common by this time. It has a phono jack and switch. I doubt anyone actually used these by the 1950s. It was really more of a marketing feature. It uses capristors, a capacitor and resistor in one package. A cost-saving measure, it makes it hard to restore the radio since every replaced capacitor requires a resistor to be installed too. By this time in the development of the AA5 radio, the design was highly optimized for low cost. It only has 19 electrical components. The radio doesn't even have a pilot lamp. The only way to cut costs much further was to reduce the manual labor required in assembly, which happened in the 1960s when printed circuit boards were introduced, and later by moving manufacturing offshore where labor costs were lower. Radios of this era used 3 different types of tubes. The octal tube had up to 8 pins and a bakelite base. The loctal tube format was smaller and featured a locking mechanism to make the tubes fit more snugly in the sockets. They were popular in car radios where vibration was an issue. Miniature tubes were all glass and smaller than octal and loctal. And for comparison, a transistor, the modern day equivalent of a vacuum tube. This is a Northern Electric 5200 from 1947, another one of the models known as the Baby Champ. It's a good example of a radio that was very popular, made and sold for low cost, and sold in high volumes during the post-war radio boom. It uses a very simple and reliable AA5 design that did not change much over a period of years. It's electrically very similar to the Model 5000. The case is bakelite painted with a mottled metallic finish. This model was sold in 6 different colors referred to as seagrass green, alpine rose, desert sand, tusk ivory, delft blue, and tortoise brown. I believe this was the alpine rose version. It looks copper colored now, but under the knobs, where it hasn't been exposed to light for over 60 years, it's more of a red color. It is somewhat unusual having no back and a loop antenna on the side which looks like a spider's web. The chassis isn't directly connected to the line, but still could give one a nice shock if they're well grounded. Definitely not up to today's safety standards. While it has a larger case and dial, the chassis is the same size as smaller radios. It has a phono jack. What made the AA5 radios cheap? One factor was that there was no power transformer. This is an expensive and large part due to all the iron and wiring used in its manufacture. The design uses multifunction tubes designed specifically for the AA5 radio circuit. The tube heater voltages were designed so that when connected in series they would operate on line voltage. New models introduced each year only differed in the style of case, knobs, etc., but the electrical parts were essentially identical. The Bakelite cases could be stamped out with minimal labor, unlike, say, a wooden case. A typical radio sold for about $30 in 1951. In today's dollars, that would be about $250, about the same as what you would pay for a modern radio, DVD player, or iPod. This is a model 5115. It features a wooden case and grill cloth. It also has a short wave band. Electrically, it's the same as the 5002, but was considered a deluxe model because of the wooden case. Most of these sets are of the so-called AC-DC type because they could, at least in theory, run on alternating current or direct current. Direct current was only ever available in a small number of areas such as Manhattan, New York, and never in Canada to my knowledge. If you plugged the radio into DC, the polarity was important. Some radios had a note mentioning that if you plugged it into DC and it did not operate, you needed to switch the polarity of the plug. Also, the line frequency in many parts of Canada was 25 Hz, or cycles as it was known then, and did not fully switch over to the modern 60 Hz until the 1950s. These AA5 type radios will generally run on 25 or 60 Hz. More complex radios with power transformers may not work correctly on 60 Hz. This model 5700 is from 1953. It's a Bakelite case painted a copper color. The front panel, which is made from a modern plastic, says Baby Champ. This shows how the same basic radio from the 1940s was still being made into the 1950s with only changes to the outside appearance. I should mention some safety issues with these old radios. In some radios, one side of the AC line is connected to the chassis. This is extremely dangerous if the chassis is out of the case or a knob is missing, exposing metal. In later radios, the chassis was not connected directly to the line, but through a capacitor that over time might be leaky and could still give you a shock. I recommend working on them only with something called an isolation transformer, and even then only if you have an understanding of basic electrical safety. When powering up a radio for the first time, restorers often use a variac, which can increase the voltage to the radio gradually, checking for any parts that might overheat. These radios typically had no fuses, so the old parts could fail and overheat. It's best not to operate the radio unattended. Some old radios may contain pads of asbestos, or cadmium plating, which is toxic and can start flaking off. It's yellow or green in color. The solder used contains lead and is not particularly toxic, but is now mostly phased out in modern electronics. This model 6302 was called the Topper, maybe because the dial is at the top. It was made for the 1949-1950 model year. It's a 6-tube radio using miniature tubes. The case is Bakelite, painted brown. This model came in 4 colors, brown, green, sand, and ivory. It has 6 tubes with tone control, making it a slightly more deluxe radio than the basic 5-tube models. This is one of the few radios that has the power switch on the tone control rather than the volume. According to the specs, it puts out a big 1.9 watts of audio output. A bit of trivia. The speaker in this radio is made by Jensen. Modern car audio buffs familiar with Jensen speakers may be surprised that Jensen speakers were being made back in the 1950s. The Jensen company actually goes back to 1910, when their first product was a telephone receiver. They developed a loudspeaker based on their telephone receiver and a phonograph in 1915. I haven't found any other examples of this radio on the internet, so it must be one of the rare models. The typical All-American 5 radio only receives the AM broadcast band. In a lot of areas, the only programming on AM now is talk radio, news, and sports. If you have one of these radios, you might want to listen to music. maybe even programming from the 1940s. You can do this by buying a low-power AM transmitter that can broadcast a signal from a source such as a computer, CD player, or iPod to a nearby AM radio. It doesn't require a license because the power is low and reception is limited to an area about the size of your house. A typical and popular model is this one made by SS Tran. It's actually a kit that you have to assemble and sells for under $100. Less expensive but lower quality transmitters are available. Here's another possibility. That phono input could be connected to an MP3 player as the music source. Just one word of caution. An old leaky capacitor inside the radio could potentially place a high voltage on the phono input that might damage an MP3 player. Only do this if your radio has been properly checked out and restored. This is a Northern Electric 5308 midge from 1949-1950. It's smaller than most table radios, does not have a dial amp, and puts out about 1.5 watts of audio power. Tuning is a little tricky as the tuning knob is mounted directly on the tuning cap with no dial cord. There's a connection for an external antenna and a length of wire was connected to my unit. The radio was originally offered in 6 colors: green, brown, red, yellow, ebony, and ivory, like this one. While the name midge could refer to the small biting fly of the same name, it was common that this style of radio was referred to as a midget. A sticker on the bottom of the radio has a warning that you need a license from the Ministry of Transport to operate the radio or risk a fine of up to $25. This was the law in Canada, and the license cost $2.50 per year at the time this radio was made. The law was revoked in 1952. This model 5400 from 1941-42 is a small portable radio which runs on AC power but can be easily carried from room to room with a handle. The case is wood covered in a plastic coating layer, giving an upholstered look. The carrying handle is attractively made of bakelite with metal trim. The shortwave band covers 6 to 15 megahertz. Offering 2 bands is quite impressive for a radio this small, only 10 by 7 by 5 inches. It uses octal tubes, and this one has various brand names, probably having been replaced over the years. There's no internal antenna, but a wire antenna is included, which can be rolled up when not in use using the provided winding bobbin. The speaker, despite its small size, is not a permanent magnet type, but has a field coil. The original line cord with cloth insulation was badly frayed and broken. The radio worked after the line cord was replaced. The soldering in this radio appears to be the worst workmanship I've ever seen. It's also extremely cramped and hard to work on due to the small size of the chassis. Replacing the capacitors with modern ones, which are much smaller, freed up some space. With the 5 octal tubes in a small wooden case with only a little ventilation in the back, I expect this radio would get quite hot inside when operated for any period of time. Our last radio is a model B4100 from 1946-47. This is a battery-operated AM radio. It's in a wooden case covered in black leatherette with a fake crocodile skin look. It's intended to operate on a 1.5 or 2 volt A battery and 2 45 volt B batteries. It has an internal loop antenna, an external antenna, and ground connections. There's room in the bottom of the case for the batteries. These are not generally available anymore and can be replaced by a power supply. The circuit is pretty standard. There's a terminal screw marked P, which appears to be for a phono input. Since it's a battery set, no rectifier is required, reducing the tube count by 1. There's also no need for power supply filtering, so there's only one electrolytic cap used in the output amp. This is the only radio I own that uses 1 and 3 volt octal based tubes. The same chassis was used in models B4100 and B4104. What's involved in restoring these old radios? While many of them still seem to work, to get them back to original or better condition electrically, the following is usually done. The electrolytic capacitors in the power supply usually fail after a few decades. The symptom is a loud hum. These can be replaced with new modern parts, which are typically smaller. Wax paper capacitors often become electrically leaky over the years due to moisture or chemical changes. These should be replaced. The modern parts are of better quality and smaller. Some purists will actually restuff the capacitors by putting paper and wax, either the original or a reproduction, over the new parts to make them look original. The carbon composition resistors often change value, and either out of tolerance should be replaced. Only rarely will one need to replace a tube, usually because it's physically broken or missing. In AA5 radios, the tube heaters are usually in series like old Christmas lights, so if one tube is missing or burned out, none of them will light up. So a dead radio may only have one bad or missing tube. Restoration also usually includes alignment, adjusting the tuning circuits if the restorer has the necessary test equipment. Surprisingly, circuit diagrams and alignment data are available as they were published annually by organizations like the Radio College of Canada. For a very rare radio, it would be recommended to leave it alone, as replacing parts would take away from its value and historical significance. I hope you enjoyed this presentation on some old Northern Electric radios. Check out my other videos on old radios, test equipment, and ham radio.